just by using the term Docker, they get confused thinking that, okay, so Docker is my only option. Now, I'm not entering whether that's a good option or a bad option and all that jazz, but it gets confusing because it leads you down the path of thinking that it must be Docker as in runtime.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 120. Stop using the D word. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsa. If you haven't listened to the previous episode that we did with Anais, you need to do that. So stop listening to this one and go listen to that one first. Okay, now you're back, right? You've already listened to the episode with Anais. If you haven't, one of the things that I did is I stepped in, and Victor stepped in with both feet into using words that sometimes could be questionable in today's day and age, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So we're not going down that path here. I'm using that as an example that words matter. Now, in saying that words matter, you need to stop saying the D word. And you may be asking, Darren, what is the D word?
Yeah, kind of D word Darren, right?
Yes, stop using my name.
Demon.
Yep. It's actually a phrase. Stop saying Docker image.
Yeah, or Docker container, right? Or at least stop saying it when that's not what you really mean. Because Docker itself is not creating Docker images. Docker is creating OCI compliant container images, which can be run by any container engine or container runtime. And it's kind of misleading because when you say, and I still see it in many products, websites, and things like that, it makes you believe that, hey, so I can use this Docker something with Docker, right? While in reality, if you build a container image, I'm trying to use the correct words now. You can run them with any container engine, not only with Docker itself, especially now that Docker is basically out of Kubernetes. And that wouldn't be so bad necessarily if Docker managed to pull out and rule the world and became synonym, like Google. It's okay in a way if you say, hey, can you Google this for me? Instead of saying, can you search it for me? Because it is almost certain that, not almost certain, but it's very likely that you're going to search for something in Google. Google dominates the market for search engine. It's okay to say Google it because that's what you mean. You mean going to google.com, typing something and clicking the search button or pressing the enter key. But Docker is now mostly limited to laptops. And it's an amazing tool to do all sorts of things on laptops, and that's perfectly fine and okay and all that stuff. But when you're running those container images, when you convert them into containers, they are not really being run by Docker. Again, they're not Docker images, they're OCI images that are run by any runtime. And it is very likely that you do not even know which container runtime you're using in your Kubernetes cluster.
So OCI compliant, what did you say? See, I'm already confused. Here's the upside of saying Docker image. You know roughly what it is, whether it's correct or incorrect. The correct phrase is
container image.
Container image.
Exactly. It's container image. The OCI might be mouthful, right? Oh, what is OCI? What is this? What is that? But everybody today understands what is a container image, right? And what is a container. So it's as opposed to what is Docker image and what is Docker.
I think it's the exact opposite. I think people understand, maybe not know, but they understand better what a Docker image is and a Docker container than a container image and a container.
I mean, I doubt that there are many people, if anybody, who gets confused if you say, hey, create a container image for me. Or, hey, can we run this as a container? I don't think that many people get confused and think, okay, so I do not know what he means by container image, right? It's more out of inertia, right? That we are so used to saying Docker image, not that we don't understand what container image is.
No, I do agree with that. Yeah, I hope so as well. But I still disagree because the concept of Docker image and Docker container pre-existed container image and container.
Yes, it pre-existed, and that's why we are so wired to say Docker image. But that does not necessarily mean that we do not understand what container image means. I mean, many people do not understand what it really, really means, kind of all the jazz about fancy terms and what's not. But in essence, container image is something that you use to create containers. Everybody understands that, or at least I think everybody understands that just as well as Docker image. The problem with that is if I speak with teams, let's say, working on pipelines, pipeline steps that will build container image and then run it somewhere, just by using the term Docker, they get confused thinking that, okay, so Docker is my only option. Now, I'm not entering whether that's a good option or a bad option and all that jazz, but it gets confusing because it leads you down the path of thinking that it must be Docker as in runtime. I still get questions. So if Docker is removed from Kubernetes, how am I going to run my Docker images? And it's only because of that term, right? Because when you explain, hey, Docker images are actually container images that can be run by any runtime, and you can build container images with Docker or with one of the 57 other tools. It's kind of, okay, that makes perfect sense, right? But you're almost constrained in the way you're thinking and what you're using and how you're using it by thinking that there must be Docker behind that. And you think that because of that inertia of saying Docker, 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 Docker. And Docker is great. I'm not trashing Docker, at least not today. It's just misleading to say because of the way we use words that Docker is behind everything related with containers.
So container image is okay. I think what you're advocating for is stop saying Docker image, Docker container, say container image or container. And then it's okay to say, hey, I'm going to go run my container image on Docker.
Exactly. Or I'm going to build that image with Docker.
I'm building the image with Docker. But the archive, the artifact, I guess, is actually a container image and not a Docker image.
Correct.
Or you could say it was a container image produced by Docker. And that's okay. But people will just keep using Docker image, which Docker almost got to the point of Google from a phrasing perspective. Almost. It almost became a name and a verb and an adverb and an adjective.
Exactly. If the dice were rolled slightly differently, that would be the case. But it didn't happen, unfortunately.
So basically, the title of this episode is Stop Using the D Word. But what are other words that we need to stop using?
I don't have similar examples like Docker. I mean, I probably do, but nothing comes to my mind. There is a completely different category of using words for the things that are not represented by those words. Like putting GitOps in absolutely everything. Whatever you're doing GitOps, not true. Putting DevOps into everything. Calling yourself being DevOps engineer. There are so many misuses of the words. Some of them were true, like Docker. Saying Docker image was completely valid and true because for a while we had only Docker to create images. And then some other terms like GitOps. Right now reviewing a product that is very heavy on GitOps and has absolutely nothing to do with GitOps. But GitOps word is everywhere in their documentation simply because it sells well. And then I do not mind anybody selling well. I think that everybody needs to get money from somewhere and finance the engineering. But over time, we get very distorted idea of what that something is, because option A, out of inertia, like Docker, or option B, like GitOps, because words are thrown around randomly.
Let me throw one out there for you. It's a C word. Continuous. Can we stop saying continuous?
When it's not. It's okay to continue saying continuous when it is continuous. That's one of those, we can even, like with GitOps or DevOps, we can have a long conversation where nobody wins because it's actually not that easy to define what it really is. I mean, it's not that hard either. But continuous, that's the easiest thing to validate. Okay, are you doing X, Y, Z continuously? Yes or no? We can just argue whether continuously means real time, which never does, or short frequencies of something. And if it's short frequency, whether short frequency is hours, days, weeks, or months. And once we figure out what continuous means, and I would say that continuous means hours, not weeks or months, then it's very easy to disprove and say, not continuous.
Could continuous be defined as based on an event that occurred?
Yes and no, depends. You can say, hey, that event would be whenever I create a pull request, I have a process that will do a set of automated tasks and then end up with something, let's say, production-ready release. And you can say, hey, this is happening continuously. Every time I create a pull request, that process is going on and there is no friction and what's not. But I might be creating pull requests after 3 months of working on something, potentially in isolation, right? And then the whole theory falls apart. So it's mostly about frequency, and frequency from the moment you touch keyboard to do something until that something is. Now, what that something is debatable. If it's continuous integration, it would be one thing, delivery could be another thing, and so on and so forth. But the clock starts ticking when you touch your keyboard. If not, you could even go to other extreme and say the clock starts ticking the moment you have an idea in your head, but I wouldn't go that far. Because there are many reasons why my idea wouldn't be feasible, why it wouldn't be a good idea to start working on it immediately. I just had this idea about great new feature in shower, and if the clock starts ticking right now, I would never be able to accomplish anything remotely continuous for that, simply because it's a great idea. I want to change the world, but still it's very low priority, or we don't have capacity to work on it, and so on and so forth. So it can take it can take weeks, months, even years between having an idea and until you even start doing the first tangible step towards that idea.
How do we prevent things like saying Docker image from happening again in the future?
It's not about preventing. It's just about putting new terms or better terms in their correct place. The more software vendors, and it's usually up to software vendors more than anybody, the more software vendors start using other terms like container image, the more our brains will be wired to use the same term. It mostly depends, I think, on marketing of software vendors.
And you just said the word. You just said the M word, marketing.
Marketing.
We're doing the alphabet today. So I am guilty of using the phrase Docker image. I am. But in my examples that I produced around the phrasing of Docker image, I was using Docker. So I don't mind using Docker image when it is fully in context of Docker. It's better than saying container image that was with Docker, because effectively I'm just using Docker image.
I think it really depends. So let's say that I'm going to invent examples that you're doing completely out of the blue. If you did an example and saying, hey, we can use Docker build on our laptops to build image, yeah, okay, sounds good, right? And that's the end of the story. If your example would be, hey, we can use Docker to build image locally, push it to registry, and then deploy it to Kubernetes, then you're misleading with the Docker image, because then it makes me believe that something should be run by Docker in Kubernetes. Or if you're having an example to saying, hey, we're going to create a pipeline where we are going to create container images, and we're going to leverage this power and the special features for Docker, that's fine. If you say if you're using Docker as only one example of the myriad of ways you can create container image, and you're using Docker just to prove the point that you can build container images from pipelines, then saying Docker image is not okay, right? Because again, you're limiting the possibilities in a way. So it really depends what you want to do. If you're promoting Docker, not promoting as doing marketing, but if you're something very specific Docker without leaving the alternatives as options to do the same thing, then yeah.
Let's get a little more granular. If I'm producing a container image today, I can think of 3 tools off the top of my head that I can use to do that. 4, actually. I can use Docker.
Mm-hmm.
I can use Canico. I can use Jib.
Mm-hmm.
And I can use Builda.
Exactly. And there is my mind stopped now. I was about to say there is another one. I know which one it is, but my brain cannot produce the word.
Right. But there's...
Build packs.
Oh, right. Build packs will do it. Or Build X. Build X, Build packs.
Yeah, there is also Build Kit.
Build Kit. But that's
which is basically Docker.
It's Docker. Is it the standard in Docker now?
Yeah.
As of today?
Docker itself.
Okay. But is it used by default, or is the I don't think it's the default yet.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay, but it's available whether it's the default or not, because BuildKit gives you the ability to do multi-arc and other things that like Builda and Canico won't give you today, I don't think. So ignoring saying Docker image, you can say an image was produced by using the Docker build kit, or an image that was produced by Builda.
Exactly.
But in creating those images, and we have those handful of tools, you've used the phrase the 57 ways to build a Docker image. There's not 57 different ways, but there are 8 to 10 probably. So if people are building container images today, I'm sort of taking this in a little different direction. If they're building container images today, what tooling should they consider using from the start? Completely ignoring what their build platforms are, whether they're in Kubernetes, whether they're on VM/bare metal, whatever. I mean, what should they look for in an image build tool?
There is actually 2-part answer, I think, to that. There is a definition of something, in this case of container images, what they are, and there is a tool. As for the tools, I think that it is perfectly okay and perfectly welcome to use different tools depending on the context. When I'm building images locally on my laptop or desktop, I'm using Docker. Docker is most convenient for me. It works well, all the jazz, right? If I'm building it through pipelines that are running inside of my Kubernetes cluster, I tend to use Canico. And probably if you're more into OpenShift, Red Hat ecosystem, Builda makes a lot of sense. If you like tools that will create those definitions for you, build packs are also great, and so on and so forth. So there are different options. Some of them might be flagged and saying this doesn't make sense to use, but there are quite a few options that make a lot of sense in different contexts. I know that many people often try to find the tool that will do something in every single context, and I think that that's kind of silly and wrong. There is nothing wrong using different tools in different contexts, as long as we need to redefine what those things are depending on the context. So for me, for example, any attempt to replace Dockerfile would be silly unless there is an amazing advantage of doing that, simply because that somebody would need to replace it all over the place. Meaning that it would need to work, in my example, both with Docker and with Canico. It's same like, hey, if you automate something and you create a script, that's great because that script can work with different tools. You can run that script locally by executing script directly. You can plug it into pipelines. You can run it from a container and so on and so forth. So it's many tools are okay, many definitions of the same thing are not. I forgot your question. I have no idea what I'm answering, to be honest.
Well, the question was, if someone is deciding what tooling they should use to build a container image, not a Docker image, but a container image. We talked about the different options that are available as of August 2021. But as time moves along, Docker shim is being removed, has been removed, is being removed, somewhere in that ballpark. Mirantis is still going to keep it in their distribution for now, if I remember right. There's no reason from a Kubernetes perspective that you should be using the word Docker ever again.
So you need to look for alternatives how to build your images if you're building them from Kubernetes, which would be then those others that we mentioned, like Canary or Builda.
Right, because if you're building images within Kubernetes and Docker shim is gone, and you should not have been even using Docker in Docker. Docker in Docker? Docker on Docker? That was always confusing to me.
Both. I heard Docker in Docker, Docker on Docker, Docker besides Docker, you name it.
So I think it's a good thing that we stop using the D word in context of Kubernetes specifically.
Correct.
If you're still using Docker locally, if you're still using Docker Compose, technically I guess you could still be using Docker Swarm, right? There's no reason why it couldn't be being used technically.
Technically it could. I hope that in practice you're not.
Hopefully you're using something like, even if you're not wanting to use full-blown Kubernetes, hopefully you're at least willing to use something, even a lightweight Kubernetes, whether locally that's Kind or as a lightweight service like K3S, referencing Anais again through Civo or some other thing that, it's just something lightweight. We're not saying move away from Docker for everything, but we are saying you should consider what your options are and then adjust your tooling as necessary, because you can have a multi-tool. You've seen like the Swiss Army knife, right? In America, they make things that are even larger than the Swiss Army knife. But the one thing that none of those tools can really do well is be a hammer. And sometimes you need a hammer. And the Swiss Army knife will never be a hammer. So even if you have a tool that can do everything and you need a real shovel because you got to go dig a hole, the Swiss Army knife isn't going to cut it for you. So, in conclusion, I think that's the first time we've ever used that phrase, in conclusion. Maybe we should, in conclusion, stop using the D word when it doesn't make sense to use the D word. It's okay to say, I still think it's okay. So I'm going to go back to the top. I still think it's okay to say Docker image in full context if I'm using, even if it's a slip up. I'm okay saying Docker image if I use Docker to build the container image. I'm okay with it. It doesn't mean it's right, but I'm okay with it because it's context. But what's not okay is, hey, I'm going to go run a Docker image on Kubernetes. That doesn't make sense anymore. So, what do you think? Victor, I know where you stand on this. And this question actually came out of one of our live streams that we had. So if you haven't checked out our live streams, you should check out our live streams. And you can check out the website. Usually they happen on Fridays. Go follow us on YouTube, DevOps Paradox. Subscribe to that channel. If you hit that bell notification there, it'll tell you when we have new live streams coming up and anything else too. A little plug for the YouTube channel today. But if you're listening for the podcast, and you normally just listen to podcasts, that's great. But if you want to interact with us live, you can check us out on YouTube, typically once a week.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.